Hello, everyone. Well, that was it. We're almost it. The largest EA Global ever. I'm noticing some confused faces. I am not Will McCaskill. Sorry to disappoint you. After every EAG, I feel so lucky to be a part of this community. I think Anders really nailed it with this tweet, with the vibe and the theory of change of EA Global, that we have these lofty ambitions, and EAG is a place for one-on-ones where we discuss how to actually do stuff. And when I interact with thousands of EAs in one place and hear this kind of feedback about how our attendees are interacting with the staff, I really feel like I've found my people. My kids were also getting into the EAG vibe. My son Ernie was working on the alignment problem this morning. And my other son, Teddy, he tends to prioritize naps and self-care. I hope some of you did the same. Before I get to the conference takeaways, I want to say a few thank yous. First, I'm so grateful to the events team. Here we are in our normal clothes. In particular, I want to congratulate Eli Nathan for his first EAG as project manager. He is not in the audience because he's out project managing, but good job, Eli. I'd also like to thank our 75 volunteers. You see some of them here in the audience in their blue shirts. We genuinely could not have done this without you. Here are our 2 volunteer team leads, and also thank you to Laundry Yard Events, the venue, the vendors, the speakers, and everyone else who made this event happen. Finally, thank all of you for coming. Next, some takeaways. Yeah, thank you. Some takeaways. First, follow up with plans. So I've heard a lot of people making plan changes at this event. I don't want that to just stop here. Think about those plans, talk about them with people who weren't necessarily at the conference. Continue to pursue those disagreements that you surfaced at this event. Remain curious, try to research some of the cruxes and figure out other information that might help you decide what your take is. And turn the connections that you made on site into friendships. Maybe set a reminder to follow up with someone or, send them a message after the conference. So last time we were here at the Palace of Fine Arts was 2017, and things were really different. So the event was, I'd say, quite a bit more scrappy, and about a third the size. After that conference, Scott Alexander wrote Fear and Loathing at EA Global. I love this blog post, by the way. If you haven't read it, please look at it after the conference. In the article, he talks about some of the weird things people work on in EA and how obsessive we are. It's really funny, but it also has a serious and beautiful ending. So before I close, I'd like to read an excerpt from the conclusion. I'm not much of an effective altruist, but every so often, I can see the world as they have to, where the very existence of suffering, any suffering at all, is an immense cosmic wrongness, an intolerable gash in the world, distressing and enraging, where a single human lifetime seems frighteningly inadequate compared to the magnitude of the problem, where all the normal interpersonal squabbles look trivial in the face of a colossal war against suffering itself, one that requires a soldier's discipline and a general's eye for strategy. All of these affecting effectiveness people don't obsess over efficiency out of bloodlessness. They obsess because the struggle is so desperate and the resources so few. Their efficiency is a military efficiency. Their cooperation is a military discipline. Their unity is the unity of people facing a common enemy. And they are winning. Very slowly. World War trench warfare style, but they really are. This is usually a pretty cynical blog. I'm cynical about academia, and I'm cynical about medicine, and goodness knows I'm cynical about politics. But this seems like a good time to remember that there are some really good people, and who knows, maybe they'll win, end quote. I sometimes hear people say that effective altruism is virtue signaling, that people just do it because they want to look good. But that always feels like total nonsense to me. I've spent almost half of my life in this community. I've met some of my best friends at these conferences, and I've played with their children. I've seen people who were determined to save the lives of total strangers, even if they never told anyone about their giving. I've seen people who spend their lives toiling in obscurity for the sake of people in future generations. There is a deep core of goodness here. We aren't perfect, but we all want to make things better. So, in the spirit of not being perfect and trying to make things better, the survey. There are 3 options for the survey: this QR code, the swap card agenda, or that link. Please note that there are only a few required questions, and it's okay to skip through things if you want to. Also, please note that I will sit here while you take that survey, and do it too. Okay, how are we doing? Anybody want like 30 more seconds? Go, like, or are we feeling, I guess raise your hand if you want me to move on. That looks pretty conclusive, I'd say. All right, thanks everyone. Please do fill it in if you didn't get a chance to finish. And yeah, thanks so much for coming. I'm gonna hand off to Olivia.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Larson. I'm a philanthropy advisor at GiveWell, and I'm really excited to be here to introduce GiveWell CEO, Elie Hassenfeld. In 2007, Elie left his job at a hedge fund to found an organization focused on identifying charities that are neglected, cost-effective, and evidence-based. Since then, thanks in part to many of you, GiveWell has directed over $1 billion to highly cost-effective giving opportunities, and we expect that these donations will save over 150,000 lives. So please join me in welcoming Elie Hassenfeld to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm Elie from GiveWell. It's really great to be here. I'm not going to tell you a lot of background about GiveWell because I think most of you probably have a pretty good idea about what we do. In brief, we do research on organizations working in low-income countries, aiming to direct as much funding as them as we can. Thank you very much. To help people as much as possible. And 15 years ago, when GiveWell started, Holden Karnofsky, my co-founder, and I believed that there were a lot of other people out there who wanted to maximize the impact of their donations. But we had no idea whether or not that was true. And nearly everyone we talked to as we were thinking about setting up GiveWell told us that donors didn't care at all about impact and that a project like GiveWell could never succeed. So it's really amazing to be at a conference like this with more than 1,000 attendees in a year where GiveWell is going to direct more than $500 million to our recommendations. We're just so grateful for the support that we get from this community. Obviously financially in donations to our recommendations, but maybe more importantly, the intellectual engagement and critique on our research. So today, what I want to focus on is 2 stories from our history. And I think that these 2 stories do a really good job illustrating 3 lessons that I've taken away. And I think these 3 factors have done a good job driving our success over the years. They've done a lot for our past, and then I also think they're important for our future. We're going to continue to rely on these and learn from them as we go forward. And so just to sort of set the stage of GiveWell, when we got started, we were focused on trying to find organizations that implemented cost-effective programs. And we really wanted to support organizations that had already demonstrated that they were effective, rather than trying to focus on creating new innovative opportunities. And in our first few years, we did this with our top charities that focus on malaria nets, deworming, and cash transfers. But as we arrived at 2013, our top charity list had been static. We hadn't added any new organizations in several years. And we also ran into a problem. The first part of GiveWell's research process focuses on looking at academic studies where we're trying to find interventions that are effective. And often we'd find interventions that seemed very promising, but no charity that was ready to implement it. We called this the "we like it, but how do we fund it" problem. And so in 2013, we launched GiveWell Incubation Grants. And the idea with GiveWell Incubation Grants was to support the development of new programs that could become GiveWell top charities in the future. And so the two stories I want to go through today are two of these incubation grants, one that we made to New Incentives, and another that we made through the organization Evidence Action. And in both of these, they illustrate these three core lessons. The first one is the value of having clear success metrics. We have used our cost effectiveness model and our cost effectiveness threshold as a mechanism for making decisions. And this threshold has served us well as we've tried to partner with other organizations to build programs because we had the threshold in mind that they had to reach to receive funding. Number two, we worked to build in feedback loops. Feedback loops so we'd know when programs weren't working, and also feedback loops so we'd know when programs were extremely effective and should be scaled up. And then finally, we invested in developing high trust relationships where we had open communication with the organizations that we worked with to support working through challenges, but also enable us to collaborate creatively to find new solutions. And these lessons have been valuable to our past. I think they'll be valuable to our future. And I hope that for those of you here who are thinking about starting or scaling programs, they're useful to you too. So let me start with New Incentives. New Incentives is an organization that when we first found it, it was really small. I mean, its budget was in the tens of thousands of dollars a year. And now, almost 10 years later, it's an organization to which we expect to deliver more than $70 million for its programming this year. It runs a program focused on incentives for immunization. It gives small cash grants to caregivers to incentivize them to bring their children to clinics for those routine immunizations with an aim of reducing child deaths. And this program was when we started with New Incentives, the goal that we had was to focus on meeting this cost effectiveness threshold where we'd be able to name New Incentives a top charity and deliver a lot of great funding. But Incentives for Immunization was not the program that New Incentives started with. Its first program, and what it implemented with the first grant we made it, was a program whose acronym is PMTCT, but it's Prevention of Mother-to-Child Transmission of HIV. If someone is pregnant, they can transmit HIV to their fetus or to their child via breast milk, or if they have the virus, they can transmit it directly to the fetus. And this is a program that had strong evidence and cost effectiveness, but we didn't find an organization working on it. And New Incentives wanted to scale it up. But after a couple years of operation, with the data it had collected, they could recognize that they weren't going to be able to bring enough people into the clinic to diagnose and treat for HIV for the program to meet a cost effectiveness threshold that we had. And so they pivoted to a second program. And the program was in-clinic delivery. And so the idea here was trying to encourage pregnant people to deliver their babies in a clinic as opposed to at home. The idea being that it's safer to deliver in a clinic than do a home birth to reduce maternal or neonatal deaths. And when we reviewed the evidence and estimated the cost effectiveness and went over this with New Incentives, we agreed that this also wasn't going to meet the cost effectiveness threshold that we had laid out. It wasn't going to cross that success metric that we had. And so New Incentives was faced with a sort of a challenging situation. At this point, they'd been operating for several years. 2 of their programs had been ineffective. We came to them and said, we're not sure if we should continue funding you because your programs haven't worked. And we offered them an exit grant to enable them to shut down the program responsibly, to enable their staff to move on to other things. But they felt, based on the lessons they had learned in these first two programs, they could create and implement a very cost-effective program. And I've had a lot of conversations with organizations over the years where we deliver bad news like this, and we have to say, your program's not cost-effective enough for us to deliver funding to you. And invariably, they argue back with us. They want to convince us that their program is cost-effective and we've made a mistake. And I'm sure New Incentives did a little bit of that. But mostly, they were really focused on turning the corner and finding the new program that would be effective. And so at that point, they settled on Incentives for Immunization, the program that they deliver today. We realized that we were going to have to help them develop the evaluation that would determine if the program was working or not. So we connected them with a research group called ID Insight to implement a randomized trial. We funded the trial. And in that, we invested in trying to shape the trial to give us the feedback we wanted. We thought about whether we could measure childhood mortality directly instead of just immunizations. It turned out that was too expensive. We also put more money into the trial than ID Insight originally anticipated because we wanted to have a large enough trial to reduce the probability of an inconclusive result. A couple years passed, we got the results from the trial, and they were extremely successful. It increased immunization rates in Northwest Nigeria by 17 percentage points. And after that, we named New Incentives a top charity and have been directing significant funding to them ever since. And this story, to me, really illustrates these clear lessons. We had that clear success metric that we used to determine success along the way. We put energy into developing feedback loops that enabled New Incentives to shut down its first two attempts and then led to this third attempt that has been so successful. And then we had built this trusting relationship that enabled New Incentives and us to work through this challenging time and move on to a better opportunity. I think these three lessons also come true with another organization we've supported in this way, Evidence Action. And we've supported two large programs at Evidence Action focused on incubation. First, a program called No Lean Season, and then Evidence Action's Accelerator. And I'm going to talk about them both in turn. We first connected with Evidence Action via its Deworm the World program, which we named a top charity in 2013. And in that process, we realized that Evidence Action was an organization that understood and valued cost effectiveness and evidence in the way that we did, such that they may be able to solve that problem I mentioned at the beginning, the we like it, but how do we fund it problem. And so we brought them a set of programs that we thought they might consider implementing. And off that list, they selected seasonal migration as one of the most promising opportunities that they could find to scale up. And so in this program, the idea is to give farmers vouchers or small incentives to encourage migration during the lean season, when work opportunities are limited in rural areas, to migrate to urban areas where they can earn higher income. And in multiple trials, this intervention was extremely successful, driving increased migration and increased consumption. So we gave Evidence Action support to develop the No Lean Season program. We also supported a randomized controlled trial. In this case, the results came back and they were really disappointing. The program had had a fairly limited effect on migration. And subsequently, we and Evidence Action talked about what that might mean, certainly in terms of its potential cost effectiveness. And ultimately, Evidence Action made the very difficult decision to shut the program down. You know, throughout this whole period with Evidence Action, and we were focused on No Lean Season, we were also looking for other opportunities to try and solve the we like it, but how do we fund it problem. And so Evidence Action developed the idea for what they called an accelerator. And the idea was to incubate, evaluate, and then scale the most promising programs. And so we first came to the accelerator, again, with this long list of programs. You know, in our research process, we're scanning academic evidence, trying to identify programs that are most effective. And we had a long list of programs that met ran into this problem of promising cost effectiveness, but no charity doing the implementation work. Off of that list, Evidence Action selected maternal syphilis. Now, syphilis is probably not a program that you think a lot about in your day-to-day life, but it's a problem that affects 1 million pregnant people globally. It leads to an estimated 300,000 stillbirths or neonatal deaths. For children born with syphilis, there's additional disability that they suffer during life. The program, the disease is also extremely easy to diagnose. It's also extremely cheap to treat. It's just penicillin. And there was no, perhaps unsurprisingly, no maternal syphilis charity that was out there trying to run this program and implement it. So Evidence Action decided to take up this program. They selected Liberia as a country to work in because Liberia combined high maternal syphilis rates with high rates of antenatal care attendance, meaning people who are pregnant are coming to clinics with the opportunity to be diagnosed and treated, so there was an opportunity to make a difference on the problem. They developed an evaluation plan so we could figure out whether or not the program was effective. The program has just kicked off recently, but based on what we know so far, we're also considering additional grants, and I think we're likely to make them in Cameroon and Zambia to continue to scale this program further. And out of the accelerator, we think there's going to be more to come, focused on additional programs that work on neonatal mortality, water technologies, and maybe more. And again, those lessons I mentioned at the beginning really came through here. We had that success metric that was focused on cost effectiveness that enabled us to decide that no-lean season wasn't working and that syphilis was promising. We had the feedback loop that led Evidence Action to shut no-lean season down. And then we had that relationship where we could work through some challenging times and land on a better outcome. So that's a lot about our past. I just want to briefly talk about our future, which I think will also be influenced by the same factors and lessons that I mentioned so far. There's really three ways we think about our future. First and foremost, we want to continue to enable our top charities to close the gaps that exist for the programs that they implement. So these are programs like malaria nets, deworming, incentives for immunization, and more. And notwithstanding the fact that these programs have received a huge amount of support historically, there are still major gaps where people who need malaria nets are not receiving them. We've been in the position to support our top charities' expansion over the last 2 years, more than doubling the amount of funding that we can direct to them. But nonetheless, the gaps still remain. Second, we continue our search for new programs. Last year, the biggest grant we directed to a new program was to a water quality intervention called Dispensers for Safe Water. The idea is chlorinating water improves its quality, reducing diarrheal deaths, mostly in very young children. This program seems extremely effective. And in general, water quality as an area seems particularly neglected to us. There's a giant funding body called the Global Fund that supports programs in HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. No similar large funding mechanism exists for water quality. And aside from GiveWell doing work to try and find and fund specific water quality programs, we're interested in exploring the possibility of creating something like the Global Fund for Water to bring more resources into this area of great need. And then finally, we're always looking for new ways we can bring our work to helping people, new approaches we can take to the work that we do. One area that we've done some work in historically, and I think we'll be doing more on in the future, is supporting research that could influence our own future decision-making about what programs are most effective. Just one example, last year, we made a grant to an organization called Precision Development. They run an agricultural program. Based on the evidence that exists today, our best guess is that this program doesn't meet our cost-effectiveness threshold for funding. But we know that with additional evidence, we could change our minds and it could lead us to fund them. And so we gave them a scoping grant to evaluate the possibility of a randomized trial. That could lead to a trial, and then if that's successful, we could imagine directing as much as $50 million a year to this program. But it all depends on the research results, and that's one of the reasons we're so excited to support research. And that's not all. There's more that we're thinking about across the board. But I think the biggest problem that we run into overall is that we don't have enough capacity for any of this. So first and foremost, we don't have enough funding to support all the opportunities that we've identified. Our top charities will end the year with funding gaps. We won't be able to direct funding to all the new programs that are promising that we identify. In the last few years, we've put a lot of energy into building our outreach team to reach more donors and raise more money and we will do our best, but I think we're going to fall short in funding this year. And then second, we don't have enough research capacity to do the breadth of work and the depth of work that's really necessary for us to do everything that we need to do. And so we're hiring and we're trying to grow the team so we can do more and help more people globally. Just speaking personally for a minute, I love my job at GiveWell because I'm motivated by that direct, legible impact that we're able to see in the lives of the people who are served by the programs that GiveWell supports. And then I also know that personally I do my best work when I have those feedback mechanisms in place, when I get some information back that says, that's not good, you should stop doing that, or that's great and you should keep doing more of it because you need to scale it up. And for people who are here, who are interested in the work that we do, if you feel the same way, we're hiring, please consider joining us. And just in closing, 15 years ago when GiveWell got started, I didn't know whether anything like this EA conference would have ever been possible, but I think all of you should feel personally proud of your role in GiveWell's success and growth, because it's literally because of you and people like you that GiveWell has been able to grow as it has. So thank you very much.
Coming up on your back. Hi. Thanks so much for that presentation, Elie. It was great. And so we're going to do a little bit of question and answer now. So if you can open your swap card apps and add any questions that you have for Elie to the app, we will add it to the list of questions. I think there might also be an upvote function, which will be helpful. But the first question that I wanted to ask has to do with what you mentioned about feedback loops. I know that at GiveWell, in addition to thinking about feedback loops in general, one way that we get feedback on our grants is by using forecasts to see how we're doing and how well we're calibrated. How is GiveWell thinking about using forecasts going forward?
Yeah, so we put forecasts on every grant that we recommend, where we assign a probability to some specific important outcome from those grants. Right now, we're specifically putting more energy into trying to forecast the amount of funding that we expect to raise. Because looking forward 5 years, we have a high degree of uncertainty about the extent to which, how much GiveWell will grow. And we think that forecasting can help direct our strategy by giving us better information about the amount of funding that we could raise. And so we're planning to work with the Good Judgment Project and put questions on Metaculus. But if this is something you're interested in, you should look out for this, because it's an opportunity for forecasting to have a very direct effect on the work that we do.
So we're at EA Global. There's a lot of effective altruists here, and a lot of the things that we think about is how to change your mind. What's something that you've changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes for me at GiveWell over the last 5 years is putting a lot more effort into delegating responsibility to senior people at GiveWell and taking the decision-making out of my hands and putting more of it in their hands. And I wouldn't cop to being a control freak in the past, but one of GiveWell's value adds is we put a lot of effort into ensuring that our work is high quality. And so over the last 5 years, we've put a lot of energy at GiveWell into recruiting great people. All managers have put a lot of time into management coaching. And with those two combined, we now have leaders on outreach and research who are fairly independent in their pursuit of GiveWell's big picture goals of finding and directing as much money as possible to great opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that we got from the audience is, you recently announced a funding gap, whereas last year you had an overhang. What did you find out?
Yeah, so two big things changed that led to the funding gap that we're now seeing. First, we put a lot of energy into building the research team. And so our researchers focused on finding these big gaps that we would need to fill. And they were extremely successful. They did a great job with this intense focus on finding available room for more funding that's cost effective. And they've created an amazing list of opportunities and potential opportunities to fund. And then the second thing we saw that we've all seen is the fall in financial markets. That stock market, cryptocurrency, and those are assets that many of our donors hold, are down significantly. And so when we put those two things together, we've in effect increased the supply of great opportunities. At the same time, there's a decrease in demand as a function of what people will give. And so we expect to have some funding gaps at the end of the year.
And another question from the audience is, what are the biggest misconceptions that people have about GiveWell?
Oh, that's a good one. I think one of the biggest ones is GiveWell is so commonly associated with our top charities. And our top charities are GiveWell's flagship product, and so that makes sense. I was even talking to someone this afternoon who said, yeah, you know, GiveWell's been pretty static. You've recommended the same things for so many years. And there's been a big shift in the overall work we do, where a lot of the funding that we're directing is not happening to top charities specifically. They still account for the majority of the funding we direct. But last year, we directed funding to the water program I mentioned, malnutrition, lead remediation, alcohol policy. So there's a long list of opportunities that we're looking at. These are all on our website, so you can read more about them if you're interested. Not yet top charities.
And so going back a little bit to your pitch for GiveWell hiring right now, somebody asked what particular or more specific talent gaps you see at GiveWell.
Yeah, I think the single biggest one is people who are great at evaluating empirical evidence and then applying that evidence to real world decisions. And so on some level, you could think about, we think about the econ PhD as one way of thinking about the skill set necessary to evaluate quantitative evidence. I should say, not everyone who does this at GiveWell has an econ PhD, so use that more as a taste of what we're looking for. But what's really hard is then applying that knowledge to practical decision making. And I think there's two challenges that people need to overcome. Number one is thinking about all the issues that come up in the real world that are different than the questions you might think of in the research paper. It's just having that practical orientation. And then the second one is we only want to do as much research as is necessary to make a decision. And sometimes people really like to go deep and figure out the truth, and the truth is great, but when it's no longer going to affect the decision because the uncertainty is bounded, people have to give up and move on. And finding those skills in combination has been hard. That's the biggest gap we're filling. So if that sounds like you, please apply.
Someone asked a pretty big question about why did you decide to continue to work on global poverty initiatives instead of, say, long-termism?
Yeah, I should say, personally, I'm a big fan of long-termism. I guess that makes sense. Humanity's future matters a lot. I think that's unquestionable. And I'm really proud of the very small things that I've done to support the efforts of long-termist organizations over the years. But for me, I just think I do my best work when impact is more legible and I have those feedback loops in place. And it's just really hard for me to motivate myself, to bring my best self to work and accomplish what I want when I don't have that in place.
And going back to the funding gap that we were talking about previously, somebody asked whether you think that that gap will be better filled by a bunch of smaller donors or a few mega donors.
So I think realistically, the most likely outcome is that the gap will be filled by a small, or I should say this differently, the gap will probably not be filled this year. I think that we are going to we're going to find those opportunities, we're going to have to raise money against them as best we can, and some will go unfilled. But as we fill them, I think practically speaking, those funds are more likely to come from a smaller number of larger donors, because we know that that's where the majority of our funding comes from. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where it does come from. You know, the marginal $10,000, $1,000, $100 going into the pot just helps us fill more of those opportunities down the list. And so, I mean, obviously we're interested in maximizing the funding that we take in, but we raise a lot of money from both the very large donors and the smaller donors, and they're both incredibly valuable.
Yeah. And so speaking of those larger donors who are valuable in addition to smaller donors, somebody asked, what framing of your story or the GiveWell story resonates the most with non-EA high net worth individuals?
Yeah, so I think the core GiveWell narrative has resonated with people over the years, which is that Holden and I were working at a hedge fund, and we personally wanted to give to charity, and were frustrated that we couldn't find information that enabled us, just as individuals, to give our few $1,000s effectively. And that led us to create the resource that we had been looking for, which is GiveWell. And for many years, I mean, we didn't have that many donors, as I said, but for many years, there was no EA. I think there was a lot of proto-EA support of GiveWell, but I think there were just a lot of people who found themselves in a similar position. They were working in the private sector, or they had a lot of wealth that they wanted to give away. They had looked to the world for information that could inform their giving, and they weren't satisfied with what they found. And when they found GiveWell, we really filled the need that they have and enabled them to give with confidence.
Yeah, thanks for that. Somebody else asked, how does GiveWell balance certainty with most cost-effective in expectation? Are the most cost-effective the most certain?
Yeah, it's a great question. So our aim is to give to the most cost-effective in expectation. And so we're not trying to privilege certainty to any extent. I think in practice, there's two factors that cause us to inappropriately, I should say, bias certainty to some extent. The first is, I think, the reality of what we see as the GiveWell value added in the world. You know, there are other organizations. Open Philanthropy is a great example of one that are focused on hits-based giving. And we see a core part of our value added as focusing on those opportunities that are more quantifiable, that have those feedback loops in place where possible. And so that nudges us more in the direction of certainty. And then second, I think the GiveWell, the personality of a person who shows up at GiveWell is often fairly skeptical and critical. And I think that in some way that, again, I should say very explicitly, this is not something we want, but I think it is a fact that we're battling. That culture that creates is one that is more likely to put a higher priority on certainty, even subconsciously. And so we're trying to actively fight against that to do what we want, which is give to the most cost-effective things in expectation.
So a broad question that might be particularly relevant after EA Global is, what's the most valuable question you've been asked recently? And I guess a bonus if you answer it too.
What's the most valuable question? I mean, I really like the question that we did at the beginning about what I've changed my mind about. I think that's a really good question. And it helps me realize the ways in which that, you know, GiveWell has grown and evolved in a really effective way.
Oh my God, well, I should have said present company excluded. Somebody asked if there are countries where you think there's still a research gap in identifying effective charities.
So I'm not sure whether the question is focused on organizations headquartered in certain countries or operating, but two of the countries in Africa where, you know, we end up giving a disproportionate of the funding that we direct are Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I think some of the reason for this is that they're very large. The DRC is a very poor country, and some of the largest funding bodies have limits on the amount of their funding they'll direct to any given country. And so, for example, the Global Fund, which is a large funder of HIV, TB, and malaria, will only direct X% of its budget to any given country, even though those countries may have a much larger proportion of the disease burden. And so I think the countries that are very poor, that have large disease burdens, are countries where we would guess there's a huge opportunity for more work that could be very cost effective.
There's a question about the future of kind of cost effectiveness and whether you think that the low-hanging fruit is gone and that interventions in the future will be worse than they are today, or whether our research progressing means that they might be better.
Yeah, I think some of the low-hanging fruit is gone. We did a project a couple years ago where we tried to imagine what the GiveWell top charities would have been in the year 2000, maybe the year 1990, 1980. I mean, there were opportunities like eradication of smallpox or doing the research that led to vitamin A supplementation 30, 40, 50 years ago. But what we see in practice is I don't think we have found most of the opportunities that are at our current cost effectiveness threshold. So just to get a little weedsy, we're at the end, I'm sure you're all ready for some detail. We think about cost effectiveness in multiples of direct cash transfers. Our current threshold is about 10 times as cost effective as direct cash transfers. And in our research team now, we're still finding new opportunities that are around that threshold. And I think one of the main pathways, I believe one of the main pathways to unlocking those opportunities will come from some of what I mentioned in this conversation today, the incubation of new programs and research. I do think some of the low-hanging fruit of just the organization is out there, there's already a ton of evidence demonstrating it works, and it's extremely cost-effective. I suspect that's less likely to be out there than it was in the past.
Yeah. So in terms of thinking about seeding new charities and not just being able to find and fund existing charities, somebody asked whether GiveWell partners with charity entrepreneurship to implement interventions.
Yeah, we're really excited about the work that charity entrepreneurship does at organizations that have gone through charity entrepreneurship's program are ones that we support, like Fortify Health as an example. And so I should just say, we're really enthusiastic about work that is leading to more organizations that we can consider for funding, and especially organizations where I think the founding team is more likely than average to come to it with values that we hold, all of us, of cost effectiveness and looking for feedback, openness to changing your mind, et cetera. So it's a great program that we're excited about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Somebody else asked, continuing on the theme of GiveWell's funding gap this year, whether you would recommend donors who give to GiveWell to consider bunching donations to give more this year if it was, substituting from future donations they might make.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I mean, I think it's a function of what we end the year expecting to find in 2022 versus the future, and I'm not sure, how that will play out. I think that this year is likely to be a relatively more cost-effective year than the long term. So I think for people with assets, it's a good year to give, but I'm not sure whether 2022 versus 2023, it's worth going for this year rather than next.
And there are a few questions in here about GiveWell's role in, bringing effectiveness to a potentially non-EA audience and kind of bringing that to the charity of philanthropic giving or global health and development. Is that something that you've noticed or you think that you've seen?
Yeah, I think we've both seen some of that, and I think we're doing more of that as time passes. So I think one really concrete example of this is there's a man named Buddy Shaw who is the founder of an organization called ID Insight. He came to GiveWell and worked at GiveWell for 2 years and recently left to become the CEO of the Clinton Health Access Initiative, or normally known as CHI. CHI is just a very normal, I think it's an outstanding, but pretty normal global health and development organization. And now it is led by a person who is just fundamentally values EA and EA ideas and is bringing them to this large organization. And we're really excited about that pathway for impact, having more like-minded people, not just starting new organizations, but in existing ones where they can shift the conversation more in the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness oriented direction.
And we only have time for one more question, unfortunately, which is, where do you see GiveWell in 5 years?
Yes, so I'm really excited about the new programs that we're searching for and supporting. In the ideal 5-year future, we've been in a position for the top charity funding gaps or the top charities to fully implement their program. So everyone who, for example, needs a malaria net has one. We've continued to expand the scope of the programs that we are identifying, and then we're able to deliver, significantly more money to them. We're aiming to, surpass $1 billion in annual donations in 5 years. We'll see if we can get there, but our vision is one where GiveWell and GiveWell's way of doing things is a large force in global health and development.
Well, yeah, fingers crossed for that. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on GiveWell's growth, Elie, and thank you everyone for coming. Amy already closed us out, but the reception is, I think, right outside, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.